I want to welcome everyone here who is joining us from across Canada, and those of you who are joining us from here in Glasgow. I am so excited today that I get to introduce you to Elizabeth May. Now, I know Elizabeth needs no introduction. Elizabeth is someone that I've known for a number of years. I think Elizabeth worked with the Rio Summit. That would be the first time I met her. She was leading on biodiversity. I was working on forestry, and she was an amazing force. Of course, she attended many COPs on biodiversity, but she became one of Canada's analysts of what was going on at COPs on climate change. This is Elizabeth's 12th COP. Now, many of us know Elizabeth as the former leader of the Green Party of Canada, as a member of Parliament for Gulf Saanich Islands. But today we're going to talk to Elizabeth about COP. Elizabeth, I'd like to welcome you today to our briefing. I'm hoping that I will get to see you soon. There you are. There you are.
Yeah, it was one of those, hello, the host has stopped your video. Hello, the host is saying hi, turn on your video. So thank you for having me, Shauna. It's really cool to be with a focus on cities where the most progress has been made in Canada is definitely through the municipal order of governments, local governments, and it's really great to be with ICLE, who of course is doing international work with cities. So very cool, and thank you for having me. By the way, I want to start by thanking the people who have this display behind me. This is actually a geodesic dome here at COP. It's very cool, and it's they said we could use it for your broadcast today, because there, as you know, there are very few scenic places, very few places with good lighting. So thank you to the Eden Project for letting me be in your incredible geodesic dome made out of all used materials, rescued materials, and it's cool.
I can't think of a more perfect background.
Yeah.
I wanted to start by beginning, we've talked about what COPs are,
Yeah.
but I want to get your sense of what really is a COP and why is it important?
Well, I think a lot of people, when you negotiate a treaty like the big treaties that we talked about when we were both at Rio in 1992, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and, of course, the Convention to Protect Biological Diversity were the two big achievements of the Rio Earth Summit. And, you know, you watch the razzle-dazzle, you watch every leader on Earth, and that was the biggest gathering of world leaders to that point in the history of the world. You know, watching everybody from George Bush to Fidel Castro take the same stage, sign the same agreements. It's pretty stunning. But the treaty is not like a dead document that goes and sits on the shelf. The way I think of the Conference of the Parties, and of course, you've probably had briefings that explained a party is a national government that is both signed, easy to do, and ratified, often involving parliaments and congresses, the agreement, and then they become a legal party to a legally binding agreement. And it's not a static document. It actually creates its own form of governance. Basically, a conference of the parties on biodiversity is a biodiversity parliament. Conference of the parties on climate is a global climate parliament, a government. And in between every COP, there are multiple committees that meet. There's a lot of interaction with scientists, particularly for climate, because back in 1988, and Canada played quite a role in this, governments created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to advise governments, because it was really clear that we had a lot of very complicated science, not because of uncertainty. That was not a thing in 1988. The myth of doubt had not yet been invented, but it is a living process. And the COP, the first COP was because it takes a while to get the governments that have signed it to also ratify. So you have governments signing and ratifying become parties, and the parties to the COP then, you know, basically meet once a year. 1995 was the first COP in Berlin. The third COP was in Kyoto, so that's a hint. What happened there? We negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, and the 21st COP was Paris, and here we are, 26th COP in Glasgow. So it's a groaner, but you know, there's good COPs and bad COPs, and you don't know which one it is to the bitter end. But Copenhagen, which was COP15.
Not a good COP.
Oh my God, that was the worst COP ever. Let's hope there's never a COP as bad as that again. We don't know which one this is going to be. I think for me, the best COP, the good COP of all times was Montreal COP11 in 2005, where it's the only time that Canada hosted, and it was a really successful, ambitious negotiation, but it all came to ashes at COP15 in Copenhagen.
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah.
Now you have talked about these documents being like legal treaties.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, you're a lawyer, you're a trained lawyer, you've had a lot of experience in the, I'm not sure I understand what that means. If you can take me through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I had an interesting experience the other day talking to a national CBC reporter who was saying, yeah, but these agreements are all voluntary, right? I said, no, these are legally binding agreements, which takes you to a higher standard. It means governments take them seriously. Well, they're supposed to take them seriously. Here's a big, well, one of my pet peeves, a little bit, actually, that suggests it's trivial. It's a massive concern that I have, is that sometime between the last really successful global environmental treaty and climate negotiations, something went sideways. So the most successful, they're sometimes called MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements. The most successful we've ever had was the Montreal Protocol of 1987. I was negotiating that too. 1987 was the treaty that saved the ozone layer. I mean, it's not hyperbole to say that. It literally saved life on Earth. It saved the ozone layer. It shut down chlorofluorocarbons and other ozone depleting substances, and it's still working. And increasingly we recognize, even though every ozone depleting substance is not a greenhouse gas, some of them are. So the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol is averting a lot of additional warming because it's shutting down more of the ozone depleting substances. But the ozone layer has, started repairing itself. Now, that negotiation in 1987 actually established all of the fundamental building blocks of the treaties we negotiated on climate. So it was in 1987 on ozone depletion that the notion that some people watching the Zoom will have heard of a lot of common but differentiated responsibilities. Like the poor countries of the world don't have to go first, right? The wealthy countries have generally created the problem. Like back in 1987, the developing world wanted access to cooling, refrigeration. Food was rotting. It was a bigger concern in the global south to get refrigeration than to shut it down. So what we did was they said, okay, the first Montreal Protocol to save the ozone layer said rich countries must reduce emissions by 50%. Developing countries can increase their use of chlorofluorocarbons by 15% with the commitment that they'll go down later. It worked perfectly, common but differentiated responsibilities, and ultimately all countries on Earth, the Annex 1 and Annex 2, however you described, all together shut down use of ozone depleting substances. Now, the big difference between the Montreal Protocol in 1987 and only 10 years later in Kyoto for the Kyoto Protocol was that in 1987, the legally binding treaty on ozone had effective enforcement mechanisms.
That's the issue, enforcement.
Yeah, it had penalties, right? So what was the penalty? Trade sanctions. So under the Montreal Protocol, and this is still true to this day, if any country, which is a party, again, that word party, a country that is signed and ratified, were to violate the terms of the Montreal Protocol, every other country that's a party could bring trade sanctions against the offending country. Now
we don't have that with climate change.
No.
None of what we're doing right now has that kind of
we got nothing
behind it. We've got nothing.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have agreements with teeth on trade deals. We have hardly a good set of gums when it comes to climate.
Okay.
And that, to me, back to trade, it was the World Trade Organization that intervened between 1987 and Montreal and ozone. 1997 climate in Kyoto and took away our tools. They
Yeah.
took away
Okay.
the effective tools to build a treaty that works.
So then I want to ask you, here we are in Glasgow. Is there any point in continuing to do these kinds of negotiations if they don't have the capacity to shift behavior?
I think if I could think of some replacement for the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties approach, I'd love to know what it would be. I think it's time to, so I think we need to continue, but not without analyzing why are we failing? Because, if you go back and read the text of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992, we pledged then to avoid a buildup of greenhouse gases to a level where they could become dangerous. Okay, that was the word. The word dangerous was what we not only haven't avoided that, the climate change issue of 1992 is now the climate emergency issue of 2021. I mean, it is goddamn dangerous when you got a heat dome over BC and 600 people die in a few days when Lytton burns to the ground, which the Prime Minister referenced. I mean, and we've had extreme drought, we have extreme weather events, we have, everything from Katrina to Superstorm Sandy to the floods in Germany. It's dangerous now. And why? Well, because we pledged to reduce greenhouse gases in 1992, and then we had an official protocol in 1997. But we went in the opposite direction. And when I say we, Canada is the worst offender in this in terms of having increased our emissions more than any other of the industrialized countries that signed on to Kyoto. Our emissions are now 21% higher. Well, now before COVID, the last year for which we have fake figures. But I mean, at a larger scale, we, the community of nations that also signed on to the precautionary principle at Rio, very important, evolving international law and even domestic law in Canada. So, recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in the wonderful Hudson, Quebec case, where they were proving that they had the right as a municipal government to ban dangerous pesticides. So precautionary principle came out of Rio and it's been helping. But when you look at it, in the cold hard light of day, from 1992, when we signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change, to now, we have emitted more greenhouse gases than in the entire period between the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s and 1992, when we pledged to go in the other direction. So I think at some point, somebody has to say, wait a minute, are we kidding ourselves? What are we missing here? How do we make this work? And that's why I'm raising the ozone protocol more often. Because by the way, it's the best example. And it's also been the example and the model that informed all the treaties we've developed on climate. And then there's something new happening, which I think is worth being encouraged about. The decision that was made at the G20 to create a uniform corporate tax rate globally. Well, they're talking about how are they going to enforce that? Trade sanctions. Okay, if we're going to move past the threats of the World Trade Organization, which, by the way, never made a ruling that environmental negotiators couldn't use trade sanctions. They just basically, the trade ministers at every cabinet table basically told their environment ministers at the same cabinet table.
I'm looking at the time, Elizabeth, and I realize I'm going to have to ask you to come back on another day because we are just scratching the surface. And I know this is like a politics 101 international course right here in just the time that we're talking.
Sorry, I went too long.
No. I don't want you to. This has been so fascinating. We've got only a minute, and I know that you understand what's going on in the rest of the country, and we've got people joining us that may not be following COP processes. And I really want to ask you, how do you make this, what is relevant here, and particularly for municipalities and cities? What is relevant? What can we take away from this experience?
Well, I think the most important thing to recognize is that the role of cities has been, and of course, the groups that are on your banner there, Shauna, hero groups, right? Hero groups. And the work of cities and local governments has been a role of leadership. And what we call what gets called in the UN system, sub-national governments are often in the lead, whether provinces and states or cities, but local governments make a big global difference, particularly when banded together. And I think it's really time for local governments to say, and for mayors to say to national governments, what the hell's wrong with you? Why did you give up all your tools? I sometimes like trade deals. It's like they get the power saws and the skill saws, and they get to really build something. And what do we get? We get those little plastic scissors that you let children have in Sunday school, and let them have. Those are our tools for climate agreements. And what's at stake? Our future.
Yeah.
For the future of humanity, the future of the planet, the life of our. How is it that the important, really big, powerful tools are given to people who are doing what? Protecting intellectual property rights, so a Michael Jackson CD can't be pirated. You know, the scale of what's at risk in trade agreements is trivia compared to the scale of what's at risk in climate agreements. And we get the cute little scissors and they get the saws. It's completely in our power as governments at all levels to point this out and say, isn't it time to reform the World Trade Organization and call it the World Trade and Climate Organization, and make sure its goals are always aligned with our climate goals? It's time.
You know, I just want to let you know, on our chat are people who could listen to you forever. And I know that I could spend another hour just understanding what you know. I would like to invite you back next week if you're still at COP.
I'm here.
Let's find another time that we can.
I'm here to the bitter end.
Great. And I'm gonna ask you to come and join us again next week. And we're gonna find a time to take and do a round 2 with Elizabeth's analysis of COP. Thank you so much. I now want to, Elizabeth, thank you so much.
See you next week.
Yes, see you next week. I want to now turn it over to Jude Crasta. This next section is a fireside chat, and that is where Jude gets to introduce our special guest. Over to you, Jude.
All right, so let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience members joining us from coast to coast and here in Glasgow. My name is Jude Crasta, and I will be your host for a series of fireside chats throughout COP26 here in Glasgow, Scotland. We are coming to you live at 6:48 p.m. GMT, that is 11:48 a.m. Pacific time, at the end of the 3rd day of COP26 here, November 3rd. We would like to thank you for taking the time to be with us wherever you are, and we are very excited to be joined today by Dr. Carly MacLachlan. Before we go further into questions, I just want to give you an overview of who Dr. MacLachlan is. Professor Carly MacLachlan is the director of Tyndall, Manchester, an interdisciplinary team working on policy-relevant research on climate change based within the School of Engineering at the University of Manchester. Carly is the Associate Director of the ESRC Center for Climate Change and Social Transformation. Her research interests focus on how stakeholders, including the public, engage with energy and sustainability issues and how evidence is used within this. Her previous research projects have covered a range of topics like setting carbon budgets and targets for cities, community energy, tidal energy, and future food systems. Lots of exciting things that this group would love to hear about today. And her current research is primarily focused on how cities can drive climate action. We are Canada Cities at COP26, and so we're thrilled to have this depth of expertise with us here today. So good evening, Carly, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let's get right into it. Carbon budgets and targets for cities. We're going to go straight into the cities question. We know one of the biggest challenges in these types of processes, at least in Canada, is like translating a lot of these targets, translating these budgets downstream into implementation when it comes to policies and actual code or financing. Give us an overview of what was involved in your experience with carbon budgets in this entire process.
Sure. So in the Tyndall Centre, we've worked a lot on the allocation of the global carbon budget that links to particular changes in temperature. So when we're talking about limiting to 2 degrees, pursuing 1.5 degrees, then, you know, the IPCC work out a global carbon budget that relates to. And then obviously, you know, that's the cake for the whole world. How do you divide that down? And, you know, people do that differently for different nations. And we found after Paris that our local authority in Manchester, what really wanted to play like its appropriate role in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And it knew that we had done some work saying that we didn't feel that the UK target took a fair slice of that. We felt it took too big a slice for various reasons. And so they wanted a kind of Paris compliant target. And so we developed a model that could you know, build in the assumptions to go from the global down to the subnational. And we built that really with the local authority. So we were partners in developing how to make that method and how to communicate it. And, you know, there's quite a lot of kind of technical detail in that about what you're including, what you're excluding, what your assumptions are, what your assumptions about negative emissions are, and things like that. And so we managed to kind of build a really good relationship with Greater Manchester to go through and talk about that. So not just with the city kind of policymakers, but with the sort of range of businesses across the city, because that target in Manchester of having a carbon budget, getting to net zero by 2038 is a target that's signed up for all emissions in the city. So you need all those different players to come together.
Wow. Okay. So we're looking definitely at a very holistic approach, and oftentimes, when we're looking at such widespread action, you need to have some level of stakeholder engagement. That's one of the things you're working on, and that public buy-in, just a public understanding of what's going on, what, where, when, why, how. So at least in Canada, that's we see in our cities, that's sort of the make or break point, whether policy gets passed at the council level. So from your experience, how do we engage interested parties, the public, just different groups into that local level to accelerate some of these plans and actually get them going?
Yeah, so I think there's something really interesting here about kind of all the different places that engagement kind of operates. So for us doing this work, you know, we were working out what the carbon budget was for Manchester. It translates to, you know, a greater than 10% reduction every year in emissions for Greater Manchester. That's what the carbon budget looks like. So it's a massive sustained reduction. And we were a bit, you know, I was a bit worried when we were doing that work that actually we would say that, and it would be like this idea that people wanted a Paris compliant carbon budget would sort of suddenly disappear when we actually said how serious that was in terms of emissions reduction. But in the sort of interim between starting that work and kind of communicating the findings of it, all the kind of Extinction Rebellion protests had been happening in the UK, and the school strike movement had really grown and was very active in the UK as well. And so actually, the IPCC 1.5 degree report had come out. So people really actually had a sense from all of that stakeholder engagement, all of that comms, that what we were doing wasn't enough. You know, this wasn't just going to be like, oh, we'll just carry on with a little bit of incremental change and we'll probably be fine. The kind of wider environment had made it that people were like, yeah, well, that seems kind of reasonable, that it's going to have to be serious reductions. And then I think it's about making sure that we explain what it means, where it comes from, and then it's absolutely about how do you actually do it. And I think that's one of the things that lots of stakeholders maybe find the most difficult thing if they're, you know, kind of pressed small businesses that are trying to make ends meet. You know, what is it that they can do? And what's been exciting for us is like our district network operator, so the people that sort out electricity in Greater Manchester, they're really actively involved. They're called Electricity Northwest. And so they worked with us to make kind of guides for different types of businesses about like, this is what this looks like for you. These are the top 5 things you could do now to help be part of it. So I think it's about thinking about how people want to engage. Some people want information. Some people want to shape the policy and be much more have a seat at the table. And in Manchester, there is a kind of, you know, a kind of big governance structure, if you like, of where people can shape the policy and kind of drive action. And, you know, certainly after a decade of austerity in the UK, local authorities don't have the resources to be like, right, we're going to sort this all out. Like by necessity, they need to engage stakeholders to really make it happen. And I think Greater Manchester's really, really embraced that. I mean, I should say that it hasn't managed yet to deliver the kinds of reductions that we're talking about. But I think the stage we're at the moment is really understanding how difficult that is and understanding the kinds of things that need to happen in order to really deliver it. So setting a target's all well and good, but you know, you think that was hard to get agreement to that. I mean, it's much like COP, and then it's actually the delivery part of it that's really where it matters.
Right. And so, okay, I have two follow-up pieces, but let's stick on the stakeholder engagement for just a second. We'll go to the governance piece after that. On this, you mentioned that there are businesses who are feeling that sort of pressure, a little bit of uncertainty. Generally, one of the things we also see in Canada across the country for cities, sometimes you might have a section of the population who have that sort of economic anxiety when there are energy transitions or transitions to even public infrastructure or how mobility is developed in an urban space. Are there lessons that we can learn from your work here in the UK that could that we could then apply to some of those the workers back in Canada within those city spaces who feel that they're shouldering much of the burden of these climate measures?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've done to kind of shift from that setting a target to actually help delivering it is that we've again taken this model of working really closely with Greater Manchester to kind of co-develop an approach. And so as part of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, we are working to develop a co-benefits toolkit that's applied to every decision that goes through Greater Manchester now. And this sounds like I'm going way off topic, but I promise I'm going to come back to your question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the idea of that, I think, is that if we make much more rounded decisions that look at all the different co-benefits and disbenefits, then we stop talking about this as a kind of, it's the economy versus the environment. You know, like these things are just so incredibly connected. And if you can do an evaluation of like the equality impacts, which is built into this decision tool that we've got, then if a particular group are going to be really badly affected by a decision, then you know, you can make mitigations for that. And it's about trying to open your mind to all of those different things rather than just the thing you work on at the authority, you know, to try and make it a bit more connected. And it's, you know, it's not a silver bullet, but it's one part of trying to think, actually, how do you design policies that don't have people totally left behind or feeling that they're too burdened by it? But I also think that is about how we talk about it. We've allowed that discourse, you know, Elizabeth was talking about like the myth of doubt. You know, I think the kind of myth of real economic hardship, as if there is an alternative that's just, we just carry on as we are and everything will be fine. You know, it's like we have to change the system. So how do we change that system in a way that's fair and just and creates jobs and prosperity and really good places to live in? And that's what's so important for cities. I think this is a central part, I think, of how we transform or enhance the places that we live in. And it's about green space, it's about good jobs, it's about connectivity. And then it's actually a much more positive thing that, you know, it's also super low carbon, it's zero carbon, rather than, oh, you know, this is gonna cost a lot, guys. You know, it already costs a lot, the impacts of climate change. And we are kind of blinded to it.
No, and so, okay, you've also mentioned that now you've had a decade of austerity in the UK, and cities were starved for some of those resources that they would have needed at the local level to act. So bringing that to Canada, we have a stratified federated system of governance where the federal government, and then you have a provincial or territorial subnational level with cities and local governments as the next level of government. There are legal things where people would argue whether there really are 3 or 2 or however many, but from the perspective of citizens, you tend to see those 3 levels most visibly. Based on how British cities or cities in the UK have worked through some of their limited resources on the ground, what were the major challenges, major opportunities? What were some of those places where you were able to push beyond the resource limitations and actually deliver on some of the things that you wanted to?
So I think one of the things that I think is really exciting that wasn't it's not an example from Manchester, it's from another authority in the UK, but where they saw it really early as an opportunity So they kind of pump prime some money in, took a bit of a risk to say, we're going to hire some people and it's going to be their job to leverage back in like project money and finance into the city to have energy projects, and we will position ourselves as a low carbon energy leader. And I thought that was really kind of a proper leadership visionary position to take, to say we put some money in because we know that we get more back out for our city. So I think that's really important. And then I think the other thing is kind of exactly what you're doing here is the network between authorities and between cities, where you don't make the same mistakes over and over again because everybody's trying to do it. You say like, this really worked and it's brilliant, but oh, don't do this bit. You have to kind of be really honest, like a warts and all sharing network you need, I think, because people have made, mistakes in it, as we all have in everything that we've done. And that learning, if we want to act on climate change at the kind of pace we need to, then you've got to make sure you share the learning, not just of the good stuff, but of the stuff that didn't go so well.
And so then let's talk about how we're going from the local to the national. And so how can Canadian cities and civil society partners, a lot of them are in attendance, or I recognize some of the names coming through on our chat. How can Canadian cities and civil society work together laterally with other cities and civil society around the world, similar to what's happening at COP26 with all of us present, to just sort of raise the pressure up the chain in terms of increasing the national ambition towards that transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you guys are doing, in the organizations you have sponsoring the event as partners, that is, a key part of sharing that knowledge and amplifying. I think the other thing that's really powerful that cities can do is they can just show that it works. So to actually counteract the kind of, that'll never happen, that's too difficult, you couldn't do it like that. If people actually just get on and show that it works, nothing undermines that kind of doomsayer will just not do anything kind of climate delay tactic. There's this sort of thing at the moment around it. I think it's in most contexts, it's terribly politically unpopular to flat out say that you don't believe in human-induced climate change now, that that's kind of largely past. But what you do get is loads of this delay stuff. And so a previous Tyndall colleague of ours that now works in Germany has done a paper with colleagues around the different discourses of climate delay, and I encourage you to have a look at it, because you'll spot them, like you'll be familiar with them, of what people do, saying that it costs too much, or we're only a little part of it, or like all these sort of common delays. And I think one of the great things, anyone that's really just getting on and doing it, even if you feel a bit like, oh, we've not got it all sorted, but we've got one bit really working well, I think it's such a powerful tool for your colleagues elsewhere to say, look, this is working somewhere else, so let's do it here. And they've told me, the thing they got wrong, so I know how to not make that mistake, and then we could just get on to the working part. So I think, there's definitely the lobbying and the saying what you need, what's restricting you, and those kind of stakeholder coalitions. So one of the things that I'm really pushing for in Manchester is for us not to all get together as a city and say, well, if only the government would let us do this or give us money for that. Like, that conversation cannot stay in Manchester. That conversation has to go to London. And that's one of the things that we're trying to bring together private companies, investors, civil society, academics, researchers, to all say, look, we identify this common issue. So like for example, we had a decarbonisation scheme for public sector buildings in the UK that, had loads of really great elements in it. So local authorities could bid for this money. It was loads of money. They could do, they could do quite a lot, but they had to spend it in such a short period of time that they couldn't do the most innovative stuff. They had to do the stuff that they could get out the door really quickly. Some authorities struggled to spend the money in time. So we have to make sure we're feeding back, not just that didn't work as well as it could have, but what we want from the next scheme that's like that. So to say, thank you, we did lots of really good stuff with that, but we could do much more if you designed it like this. And we have to amplify and be pretty direct about that, I think.
There are a lot of interesting points you bring out there, and it's what I find interesting through this is seeing a lot of the similarities with how cities in the UK are dealing with, saying that we have to go to London, have to come together with all these partners. I mean, not that it's surprising that politics works similarly across the Western world, but how similar, how the challenges tend to rhyme when it comes to what people are experiencing from the local to the national level. One of the other things that, now, of course, like in some of the differences between the UK and Canada, Canada is a very vast country with the population much smaller than the United Kingdom, and the population is spread out with these like urban nodes east to west. And because of that, because of having such a large landmass, sprawl is just something very tempting for cities. And of course, the mobility emissions, the transportation and energy emissions just go up along with that sprawl. What can we learn from your transition work here in the UK, that even though the geographical situation might be different, there are some things that we might not have thought about to look to the UK for in cutting back from our emission sources within whether it's mobility or energy generation?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think that that learning is in both directions. You know, you guys will have done things that the UK could and should be learning from, and I think it's making sure that we don't think anyone's got kind of all the right answers. And I suppose the transportation piece is like, that's a really key part of making sure people feel engaged in the transition, that they, you know, if that their mobility requirements are understood in that. And that doesn't mean necessarily that you travel in exactly the same way, but that you have the same sort of level of like service in your mobility. So, you know, I think that engagement piece we talked about before is hugely important. But it's also about for us in the UK. So yeah, you know, really a different context geographically. But you know, one of the things that we are still doing is building in places that are, you know, at risk of flooding, and we aren't ensuring that every new building is zero carbon or net zero. So we're building stuff that we'll have to retrofit, but also making sure that that new like sprawl, that, you know, the new developments that are permitted, that we embed transportation at that point. You know, I think that's the real issue, that you kind of construct a problem and then have to sort it out later. And in all of this now, like, it's not like we've not had enough warning about climate change. This should be from the inception of all of our plans, and every decision should have to be considered from a carbon perspective. And I think if we don't have the mechanism to do that in our authorities, and you know, I don't think we did in Manchester until we've started doing this work. We had some elements of it, but I think it's enhanced with what we've done. And by trying to do that, we are finding areas of policy and strategy that do not take account of carbon. You know, key issues in housing and transport and things. Now, everyone's grappling with this and they know they've got to sort it out. But, you know, it's not like this is new information in 2021. We had climate change strategies and plans for decades, and yet we were allowing policy to come through. It's like, oh, well, that's the housing, you know, we don't need to connect housing and transport. And I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious. There was some connection, but we still allowed some developments where those things weren't connected. And we have no capacity, no space emissions wise to do anything that's bad anymore. So I think, you know, we often talk about stuff that's good, how to make more good stuff happen. We also need to stop doing stuff that is kind of, you know, carbon daftness. Like we have to make sure we have a way to stop that, a kind of like a catch on the end of the pipe of those decisions, or ideally right up at the front of making anything like that. Just don't do it. There's not enough space in the carbon budget to do these things anymore. You've got to stop the bads as well as doing the goods.
It's fascinating when you put it into concrete numbers like that, where you're able to see like, nope, we don't have more room in a very tangible way for people to then actually assess their impact. So in a slightly different vein, this is going to sound for our audience, but I found this pretty interesting when I was doing some research on Dr. MacLachlan's background and work, and pretty relevant now that in many parts of the world things are opening up. We're having public events again. One of the things that I found interesting, some of your work involved making concerts and tours zero emissions. Tell us more about that, because building community is something that that we're very focused on, at least in our neck of the woods on the West Coast. And so how do we, I don't want to say build back better from the pandemic, because it's an alliteration that's so easy and overused, but how can we build community again more sustainably?
Yeah, so I think, you know, that build back better, I mean, that is really what we were talking about in that project. And you know, another way of thinking of it is like the reassembly of our practice that has been completely paused and broken down through COVID with all the things we weren't allowed to do. So as you start opening up and redoing things, could you bake it in right then from the inception? So yeah, I mean, we got a call from the band Massive Attack to say that they would like us to work with us to look at the emissions in their own tour, and then the emissions more broadly in the sector and how we could try and drive that down. So we started that work before the pandemic, and then obviously had to kind of pivot and rethink how we framed that because the sector's had such a difficult time during COVID. But we produced this roadmap that has kind of three key points in it, I suppose. So one, and it's kind of similar to what I've been talking about with cities, you think about it from the inception of your tour. So you pick the dates, you pick the locations, and you plan to be able to minimize your flying, eradicate private jets, and swap to the train or other lower carbon forms of transport if you can. The second part is that everyone has to use kind of the direct things they control. So designing their show in a way that moves less stuff about, moves fewer people about, but also to use your wider influence. So, you know, if you've got a supplier that doesn't have what you want in terms of low carbon equipment, to say that that is what you would like, and, you know, in future you would hire that, or to go to a supplier that does have it, you know, those kinds of things, make those partnerships. There's been some really cool stuff around kind of leaving a legacy, you know. So if a band works with organizations to like deploy more renewables, that they leave, you know, they could leave that after the tour, you know, so they can actually have a kind of ongoing legacy there. And then the third part is, you know, monitoring and review. So there's quite a lot of kind of pledge campaigns and stuff like that in all sectors, but, you know, music and events have done that. And because of a growth in the sector, you know, in the festival sector, for example, in the UK, although there had been this pledge to cut emissions in half, when they went back and looked at how people were getting on, although lots of festivals had done good stuff, the overall emissions had increased. And because we know it's overall emissions that count for climate change, we need to make sure that we're going back and monitoring that. So, you know, we continue to work with the band and with other people in the sector to kind of do what we can to help drive that ambition. But I think what's really exciting in this kind of context is it's people stepping up and saying, well, this isn't kind of directly our responsibility, but we feel like we can make a difference here, and we feel like we could work with our friends and colleagues in the sector and put our kind of power into it. And so, yeah, it's been a really fun project to work on. And I hope that, you know, we can actually start delivering some much lower carbon tours as a result.
Yeah. So we're just coming up on time, but I do see 2 questions in the chat. And so what we'll do is we'll go quickly through both of them because they're really good questions. And I think it would, a lot of folks would love to hear about these. The first one being, folks would like to know, can we see or learn more about the co-benefit toolkit that you mentioned? It would be so helpful for one of the audience members.
Yeah, so we're piloting it at the moment. It is in quite a pretty Excel sheet, but still an Excel sheet. And I'm more than happy to share it as it is at the moment and with some insights, but we're gonna make it something that's freely available to use once we've piloted and informed it. But I'll pop my email address in the chat, and anybody that would like it, just drop me an email and I will get in touch with you and send it over to you.
Perfect. And I think the next question that we had comes in, cities are well networked across Canada. Sounds like they are in the UK as well. Are there natural allies in other sectors you think cities should be coordinating with outside the government? So whether it's civil society, business, etc. For instance, the energy sector or the transportation sector, are you seeing those sorts of collaborations forming there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just totally essential. And obviously it's different in every different setup. So like in Manchester, for example, there are devolved powers that are different to other cities. So like Manchester has kind of more power locally than other cities have compared to the national government. And I suppose it's looking at how you can make that work in your context. I suppose I would say start with the ones that that are saying they want a net zero target and they want to do all these things, and then use your influence to kind of demonstrate that's working and get the other people that are maybe less enthusiastic. But you absolutely need them all. And I think, particularly back to that idea that, doesn't this kind of cost a lot, and that kind of economy versus environment thing. I think if you can get commercial actors who see this, who understand it, and realize that this is the future for their business, that brings in all kinds of people that actually, just speaking as an academic, or I think as a policymaker or a politician, it doesn't, we all speak to kind of different audiences. So if you can get those kind of on-board commercial interests in, they can release a load of capital, they can drive it, they can make jobs in your locality, and they can bring other businesses with them. So I think it's super powerful to do that.
Well, Dr. MacLachlan, I hate to end this because I'm sure there's a ton. I can see more chat coming through. I think you're going to get a lot of email. There's another request for your email address just coming through, and I'm sure it's a bit up in the chat, but I'm sure Dr. MacLachlan can put it again just for convenience sake. But Carly, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time here.
Thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and so for all of our viewers back in Canada, or for those who are here locally in Glasgow, enjoying some dinner and drinks right now, probably, we thank you once again for joining us. We'll be back here every weeknight at 6:30 p.m. GMT. In week 1, that is 11:30 a.m. Pacific. You can calculate down the country. In week 2, that's next Monday, we'll be at 6:30 p.m. GMT again, but that will be 10:30 a.m. Pacific because of the daylight saving switch. Don't forget, tomorrow, if you are in Glasgow and have access to the Blue Zone in person, we do have at 4:30 p.m. GMT the Canada Multi-Level Action Pavilion panel that's taking place within the LGMA Pavilion in the Blue Zone. It's also hosted virtually online. You can find more information about that on our website, citiescop26.ca/road to Glasgow. But thank you all for being here once again. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good morning, have a good afternoon, have a good evening, and mostly goodbye. Thank you all.